So thank you very much for joining us for this urban security briefing. Sorry, we are a bit late, but finally here with you. So today we ask a big question. What are the implications that global urbanization brings to the character and conduct of war? And we have, unfortunately, several examples of that in recent years, over the past decade. It is no coincidence that most violent armed conflicts over the past decade, such as the war against ISIS, the civil wars in Libya, Syria, and Yemen, have not only devastated cities, but also involved protracted urban fighting, Mosul, Tripoli, Aleppo, Hodeida, among other cities. But in this discussion, we want to identify how the social, spatial, and political features of large cities influence the wars themselves. And to answer this big question, we brought in two hugely influential thinkers on both war and cities. So Mary Kaldor is a professor of global governance and director of the Conflict and Civil Society Research Unit at the London School of Economics. And Saskia Sassen is the Robert S. Lind Professor of Sociology at Columbia University. Mary and Saskia are the editors of a new and thought-provoking book called Cities at War, Global Insecurity and Urban Resistance. So shall we start then with Mary? Tell us a little bit about the book and what your thoughts are on this relationship between cities and war.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Well, this book came out of two research projects I was running at LSE, one a DFID-funded program, largely focusing on Africa, and the other a European Research Council program that I was running called Security and Transition. And we had a lot of researchers in both programs. We focused on field research and empirical research, and I thought it would be a really nice initiative to bring in the young researchers to focus on cities. And I asked Saskia, because she was the person most associated with cities, if she would help me. And I think what's really important about the book is the idea that comes out that is very much Saskia's idea, which is urban capabilities. Saskia has written widely about the notion that the global problems of today can be best addressed at the level of cities. And I really wanted to make that argument in relation to security. So that's what the book is about. Now, to illustrate what we mean by urban capabilities, and Saskia is going to talk about it more, but I just wanted to start by using what we called the metaphor of the yogurt run, which has come out of my research on Syria. So what is the yogurt run? Well, the yogurt, many of you have heard of Eastern Ghouta, which was under siege for most of the war, which was where the chemical weapons attacks took place, which was one of the areas where people suffered worst in all of Syria. But in Ghouta, there is a dairy farm that supplies most of the yogurt and other milk products to Damascus. And so the dairy farmer made a deal that the government would not bomb his farm and he would supply yogurt to Damascus. And in fact, his farm became a little safe haven where many displaced people were able to congregate. And so we say that the yogurt run is a little opening in the siege, which we find in all cities, that somehow all cities need to cooperate in order to survive. So that's the beginning of the argument. But what I'm going to do is to talk about a little bit about our findings on why war is increasingly urbanized, and then Saskia is going to develop more the argument about urban capabilities. Historically, the main sites of classical war were the countryside. If you read the great strategists like the Chinese Sun Yat-sen, or you read even the latest US Army manual, it says when you're fighting, you should try to avoid and bypass cities. And there's a reason why we talk about battlefields, because battles tended to take place in fields. During the Cold War, we expected battles on the East German plains. Of course, over half, or maybe around half, I don't know the exact figures, of fighting in World War II did take place in cities. But I think you can make the argument that this represented a sort of transitional moment. Likewise, if you think about revolutionary warfare, you know, people like Mao Zedong or Che Guevara recommended that the revolutionaries find safe havens in mountains and jungles rather than what is the case today in skyscrapers and other urban areas. But again, already this was changing with the war in Vietnam and in particular the war in Algeria. So what are the factors that mean that wars are so urbanized? Well, one obvious reason is just that the world is more urbanized, that over half of the world's population live in cities. But I think another factor is that the change in the nature of war, that war is no longer consists primarily of battles between two similar sides. War is now a very different phenomenon, which I call new wars, but which could have different names. And let me just say one or two features which explain why they're so relevant to cities. First of all, they're fought not by regular forces, but by combinations of regular and irregular state and non-state actors who are very loosely coordinated, and communications and money a key to their coordination. And again, as Saskia has shown in her book In Global Cities, the kind of communications infrastructure and the financial infrastructure is largely based in cities. Secondly, identity politics. Contemporary wars are very often about ethnicity, religion, sectarianism. And whereas in the past we thought of cities as these havens of cosmopolitanism and multiculturalism, what we see now is an increasing ghettoization of city, where migrants from the countryside congregate in their ethnic or religious areas, and where traditions get reinvented and even become more extreme. So what we see is a combination of identities in cities as opposed to this civic cosmopolitan ideal, although that exists as well. And, you know, we should be aware of the conflict between the two. Thirdly, tactics. Most violence in contemporary wars are against civilians. They're aimed at political control. They're aimed at controlling particular areas usually by expelling people who don't agree with political control. And so what you see is the typical feature of contemporary wars is massive displacement. And you see cities crisscrossed with territorial fiefdoms, where the various armed groups have established their authority through atrocities, through deaths, but above all through displacement and through the destruction of cultural symbols. And of course, I should add that this massive displacement contributes to urbanization. The growth of cities like Pristina, Baghdad, Basra, Kabul have all been the consequence of massive displacement in war. And then finally, contemporary wars have a different kind of economy. Classic wars were usually financed through taxation and borrowing. These wars are financed through various informal and criminalized sources, which you find in the cities. And, you know, whereas the new city, in the classic cities of Charles Tilly were based on emerging manufacturing and trade, these cities have been very much based on state provision. And when state provision falls, it's substituted for by predation and criminalization. And we have what people in the book have called the ville sauvage, or the feral city, where there's very little infrastructure, very few services. And these sort of features of urban war are very much complicated by external interventions. And in the book, we talk about what I call security cultures, but for the purpose of this talk, I just want to distinguish between two types of intervention. One is the war on terror, and the other is what we call the liberal peace, UN multilateral interventions. In the case of the war on terror, we have local violence hugely exacerbated by bombing, by drones, and this kind of activity, so that the most insecure cities we look at are the cities where there's a counter-terror, terror, war, all merged together. The liberal peace, which sometimes exists side by side, as in Bamako with the war on terror, consists of large UN forces and UN civilians and NGOs, but they all tend to live in enclaves. It started with Baghdad, where everybody talked about the green zone. The internationals were in the green zone, and everybody else was in the red zone, which was very dangerous. The green zone was protected. They had their nice hotels and swimming pools. The red zone was very dangerous. But actually that green zone, red zone division is everywhere. You see it in Kabul, you see it in Bamako. Nevertheless, where it's just the liberal peace, we do find that to some extent, it does provide safe havens for people. We don't talk about South Sudan, but for instance, in South Sudan, UN areas have become protected areas as people flee to the safety of UN areas. So basically the interest of this book is the case studies. We brought, rather than the topping and tailing of me and Saskia, we brought together a whole series of really interesting case studies, and I can't possibly, with lots and lots of empirical material that I hope people can make use of. But just to say something about those case studies, we have three, Bamako, Kabul, and Baghdad, where you see both a mixture of the war on terror, the liberal peace, and contemporary, what I call new wars. And these are the most dangerous and insecure of any of the cities we look at. Then we have two cities which are quite interesting, where you just you do have the war on terror, but you also have other kinds of urbanized, criminalized violence, and that's Karachi and Ciudad Juarez on the Mexican border. And these are still pretty bad, but less bad than the first three. And then we have one fascinating case study of Goma in Congo, which is really a situation of new wars and the liberal peace. And the cities does to some extent, even though it's ghettoized and divided and full of walls like everywhere else, does to some extent provide a safe haven for refugees, for criminals, for armed groups. So that's a very interesting story. And then finally, we have two cases where there's no external intervention, and which are actually the most peaceful of our cases. One is Bogota in Colombia, where a deliberate urban civic peace strategy was pursued. And the other is Novi Pazar in Serbia, where local leaders really worked, even though this is a Muslim city inside Serbia, local leaders worked throughout the wars to prevent the war from coming into the city. Nevertheless, they couldn't completely succeed because they were inundated with refugees from Bosnia. They've suffered from structural adjustment programs, but nevertheless, it's a very interesting case study. And so what is it that they have in Bogota and in Novi Pazar? Well, this is where Saskia comes in and tells us about what she means by urban capabilities. And so I'll hand over to you, Saskia.
Well, thank you. That was so well described, Mary. That was fantastic. So I agree with everything that you said, and I think that is really part of the story, you know, that we develop in the book. It's a critical part. I guess what I was thinking of bringing in is the notion that Mary already alluded to, which is this urbanizing of war. I do think that we must take that extremely seriously. When you think of the big wars in the past, in big oceans, in open fields, etc. And so people often have, your average resident, your average citizen, has a very vague idea of what these new wars are about. And one language that has been used is that these are new wars. And they involve, you know, the same levels of brutality, but it is different because in the classical war, what you have is an intermediate actor, which are governments who have their own interests and their own alliances. And this other type of war doesn't have that. Now, for me, so one of these notions that I really care about is what are the urban capabilities that can allow residents to be parts of a conflict, but under very different conditions from what it would have been in the traditional notion that we, let's say in Europe especially, have developed of what is a war, you know, where all these countries in Europe at one point or another, they were enemies, you know, it is extraordinary. And that's a bit the notion of war that if I think of my students, that they often have, you know, it's a certain kind of understanding. Now, secondly, this notion that cities really are interdependent, they need other cities, a given city needs other cities. So that then the yogurt run, as we called it, is one, of course, just lovely example of that. Its simplicity, its minimalism captures something that you have a very hard time forgetting. Like, I think, Mary, you and I will never forget the yogurt run. We may remember all kinds of things, but that one we will not forget. And so the fact that the city, when the city is at war, it cannot simply be armed forces, tanks. There is all kinds of other stuff, clearly, which constitutes a city. Now, that also means that war in a city is a pretty traumatic event. You know, it means that it's not just soldiers and armies, it's residents who have often nothing to do with the war, who don't have any preferences. So war in a city is nowadays, on the one hand, the more common form. If you look around the world, it happens in cities to a very large extent, which is very alarming. On the other hand, the question is, and that's why the yogurt run is so interesting, what are the alliances, the facilities, the modes that residents of a city do not forget and that they will call upon, because that's how they think, that's how they perceive that. The enemy is a different actor for the urban condition than what it is when you have two armies, Napoleon style or whatever, confronting each other. So war in the city, on the one hand, and I don't know that for a fact, maybe Mary, you can confirm or disconfirm, but it seems to me that more and more wars are these asymmetric wars for whom the urban condition is one field for action. It is not, as in the older days, a vast open field where two huge sets of tanks from two different countries that are at war are going to have an encounter. I mean, these wars nowadays are pretty specific. I've been looking quite a bit also at the question in Israel, you know, that's a certain kind of war that happens there. But again, this is not about big tanks. And then what the case of Israel shows you also is the extent to which, even without big armies, there is war and it's brutal. And in the case of Israel, you know, we have a very, very extreme condition probably between the Palestinians and a certain sector of the Israeli leadership. So one question, and I'm not sufficiently an expert on this, is whether what we saw in our study and what one sees today, say in Israel, that kind of war that is internal, it doesn't have to do with grabbing land of an enemy. Are those today's wars? Or do we know of situations where that older version of war is still in play? Mary, do you know that? Because when I think about it, I cannot think of countries today where you would have that kind of, the real heavy-duty war zones that we created, say, in World War II in Europe.
Well, I suppose. Well, no, you go on and on.
No, but say so. Are there such spaces today? I mean, it's a different type of, or not? And that is why the war run is interesting.
Only insofar as conventional war comes in through bombing. It's not through tanks facing tanks. But right. Of course, the Syrian war is far worse because of the use of bombing than any of the other wars that we're familiar with. Ukraine is often considered a hybrid war, both conventional and unconventional, but actually, although it involves Russia and NATO, it's very much through unconventional means, through propaganda, what the Russians call non-linear war. So I think you're right. I mean, there are very few battles of a traditional kind.
Yeah, yes. Which is, on the one hand, I would like to maximize the positive side of that, but on the other hand, wars, after all, when you look at World War II, there were norms in play. They were not always obeyed, but when peacemaking time came, they were respected. And I think that is one thing that we have lost a bit, that there is the respect for certain, is gone. And that probably also has to do with the fact that the leadership of countries is less powerful today than it may have been in that earlier period after World War II. So the question of war has changed. And one question for me then is, how far will cities be actually zones where conflicts happen that at one end have little to do with war as we think of it, but at the other hand could enable under certain conditions, and that is very alarming to me, could enable and sort of this older fashioned war of tanks, etc., but not tanks as in tanks, but the equivalent of tank, airplanes, dropping bombs or whatever, something like that. When you look at how Trump thinks of what's happening, you have a sense that he would love to bomb the hell out of a few countries, and you have people in the United States, a country marked by a certain level of ignorance, which is very widespread about earlier histories and what it all means. I cannot imagine that something like that could happen, but at the same time it could, these would be wars that are very different from World War II. Our big image is, of course, World War II. And so what then I want to recover, just to conclude, is the importance of the urban condition securing an ongoing little peace, if you want, because cities need each other, because no city is fully self. It needs other cities, it needs other spaces, it needs other sources. And so to what extent the fact that cities become dominant could then also become a fact that shows us the limits of war, and the limit because of the limits of cities, because no city is completely self-sustainable. I mean, there might be a few somewhere in the north, or in Patagonia where they have to be, but that is sort of a question.
And just to add to that, I mean, the cities that we look at, I mean, in classic wars, there was a tendency to autarky, to try to provide everything you needed inside the country, whereas in these wars, these are totally globalized wars. Everything is imported. Yes. And everything is exported, drugs, antiquities, whatever they're smuggling. But I think Saskia's key point, if I can summarize you, is this idea which she talks about, tactical urbanism, that in these wars in cities, which are different from the confrontations of the past, people just have to survive, and they have to make deals like the yogurt. They have to get there. They have to have access to infrastructure. They have to have access to services. They have to cooperate. And those little forms of cooperation do provide a basis for an alternative. And that's why it's so important thinking about the cities.
Yeah, no, that really is the case. It's very interesting in that sense. Do we have questions from an audience here, or?
Saskia, thanks. Thank you very much, and Mary as well. I have a follow-up while we give time to our audience to think about questions. So in order to ask a question, you can, for the audience, as you can see in the screen here, you can click on raise your hand, in which case we will give you a voice and you can voice your question, or you can type your question on the Q&A, and I'll try to gather as many questions as possible from the Q&A field. So while we wait for the first questions to arrive, a question to both of you, Mary and Saskia. Often, especially working on the strategic studies field where we have a lot of interaction with militaries, one driving factor of interest for war in cities or cities at war is the urbanization trends in the world. So the fact that there are so many more people living in cities, and Mary, you cited that at the beginning. But I wonder if you think that, and obviously an important fact, an important reason why that is that more people are affected by war. So it's good to look at how they are affected by war. But I wonder if urbanization itself, meaning the rapid growth of people in increasing numbers living in cities, is itself a driving cause of war or conflict in cities. Is there something about the shape of cities today or the way that they have urbanized? If you want to talk about the poor cities, you know, global south or developing world or fragile cities, the way that they are rapidly urbanizing, is that in itself driving conflict?
Can I say something? I think it does both, actually. I think on the one hand, cities generate what you might call civil society. And I think one of the big changes after 1989 was that in the 60s and 70s, students and intellectuals, kind of who were radical, who wanted to change the world, dreamt of going to the countryside and becoming a revolutionary. Whereas since 89, I think those same people dream of being civil society. And that's a very positive change, actually.
Right.
But at the same time, there's another class that comes into the cities, and these are the rural migrants. And one of the impacts of neoliberalism has been so many people have been thrown off the land. Saskia talks brilliantly about it in her book, Expulsions. And many of them come to the cities where they can't actually find jobs and where they're really vulnerable to religious and ethnic extremists and vulnerable to extremist ideologies. And they're the people who get recruited by armed groups. They get paid to join a militia. So it may not be the ideology, it may be just a job. It may be in your field criminalization. It may be that they join an organized gang. But whatever it is, there's something about what is happening to the city that makes that possible. And I think, you know, one of the things is that we talk about violence as conflict in which we think it's about political goals. But actually, it's more how the city functions. That violence becomes a way to gain access to resources. It becomes a way to emphasize your identity. And it's not so much about, but where there is a real contest, I think, is between the classic idea of the city as this civic cosmopolitan space and the idea of these extremist identities. I mean, one of the writers on cities calls contemporary wars urbicide. It's an attempt to kill the civic culture of the city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to add something else to this, and that is that, I mean, there are two issues. One is that the city is a place where those without power can get to make a history, a politics, you know, have a fight with whatever. You know, they're not isolated and forgotten. They are there, they are present, and that can be, I think, a very important factor in making people want to go into a city, even if they know that the city is more expensive than a rural area, etc. Second point is, of course, that the value of land has increased enormously because we have less and less land. We killed a lot of it, we built on it, etc. So that expelling small farmers, small holders, as we call them, right, from their land, has become a very, very significant practice in the last, 20, 30 years. That's a very sad story very often. So we have these huge slums that get bigger and bigger, in many parts in Latin America, in Africa, not in Europe, very little in Europe, probably. But that is an issue, that the city is the last place where more and more of the poor can put their bodies down. It's like, and in certain parts of India for me is always one of the most shocking. I'm more angry about India than I am, say, about the Chinese. I find India highly, highly problematic. But you see, at night, in any little piece of space, these bodies rolled up in gray, thin blankets between where the cars are going, in the two different directions, in that in-between space. This is a horror. This is unacceptable. Now, India is a country that has extraordinary elites of intelligence, etc. And then it has the absolute strongest indifference, to the poor that I have seen in any country. And I grew up in Latin America, which is no kind little zone. So how is it possible that a country that has such a brilliant intelligentsia as they do, and then that absolute indifference? You would think that the city would become as a site, would become an invitation for people to see the miseries, as opposed to when you are in a small, private whatever, you don't see the miseries, right? If you're a private town and no, it doesn't matter. And so that to me is very alarming. I think that the Chinese have done better than the Indians have. There are two very different cultures, clearly. But to me, it's very alarming that India, with such an intelligentsia, brilliant, blah, 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 is one of the most brutal countries when it comes to how the poor are handled. And that, I don't know where that comes from. I don't know what that means. But that I find deeply alarming. And it is an absolute foundational neglect. So in Latin America, where I grew up, you have a lot of people who are homeless. But there is a sense of recognizing it, of being ashamed that it exists. In India, you wouldn't see any of that. That to me is also one of these mysteries. How is this possible? Anyhow,
Thank you.
Much on that.
So we have two questions now. One to be asked in person and the other or by voice, and the other written down. So I'm going to try to compress them for the sake of time. The written question is about differences within the cities. So difference between neighborhoods within a city. So this participant has used to live in Syria, and she knows of the existence of animosities between neighborhoods in the same city. So what are your views on the divides between areas in the city? Is that something that you find a characteristic of war in cities today? And so now I will give a voice, or Tom, our IT wizard, as I call him repeatedly, will call in, and forgive me if I'm pronouncing the name incorrectly, Yogendra Kumar.
What a name, beautiful name.
Well, thank you very much. I wanted to add one more dimension to urban warfare, which has been talked about. And I think here, the issue perhaps in my view, is that the terrorists actually use the asymmetric urban warfare, not so much to win the war, but actually to capture a city like we've seen in Mosul and we've seen in Marawi in Philippines, to capture the city knowing fully well that at some stage they're going to lose it and lose the conflict there, lose the control of the city. But in the process, what actually happens is that the city gets further radicalized, because not only is there violence perpetrated by the terrorists, but also where the national armed forces come to liberate the city, there's also, it's done in a very violent way. As a result, what actually happens, the reconstruction of cities takes much longer. And in the process, what you find actually is that the initial objective of the terrorist actually is to create further radicalization of the region and the area. In that larger objective to succeed. So my question really is this, that are there some benchmarks which can be set when the cities, whether in the developing countries or developed countries, when the cities are being governed, what can be the benchmarks that can be set in a manner as to make the cities perhaps resistant institutionally to this kind of a process? That's one question. And that also involves not only that the national army is going to liberate the cities, but external intervention to facilitate that process. So one actually, as I said, is that what kind of benchmarks can we have in terms of ideal urban governance? Of course, that has to be linked to the larger issue of national governance, but certainly we can focus on the cities for the purpose of governance. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Marek Rohr-Garstecki. Go ahead, Marek. Perhaps you have to unmute yourself.
Hey, thank you.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to make three little points. It's not really questions. Maybe because,
very quickly, please.
Yes, sure.
Sorry.
Because I'm Polish, for people like me, the town as a focus of war really started in 1939, both in German bombing campaign of Warsaw, which was designed to break the will of the people of the country to fight, and then the reverse, the Warsaw Rising. We just have an anniversary a couple of days ago, which also was the focus of war coming from the city itself. One point which I don't know if you concede is that I don't see the war shifting from the field to town right now, because if we go back into Middle Ages, the towns were focus of war. This is why they have walls, this is why they have gun turrets and so on. So maybe we're talking about phases, different phases. And just a thought, maybe giving some thought to that phase, the Middle Ages, may throw some light on the current phase. And the last point, being all involved both in being in IISS, but now being Poland's representative habitat, I'm also interested how these inner city dynamics create war-like situations. You can go back a few years in the country where I'm saying, in Kenya, how the inner divisions, ethnic divisions, were used by politicians, state politicians, so not on the city level, but using town to play national politics. So just these 3 points. Thank you.
Mary, would you like to start?
Okay, so on the first question was about Syria and I think contemporary wars are hugely decentralized and fragmented. And there are big differences between different areas. Some areas are under siege, some areas have managed to keep out of the war. And that's an incredibly important feature of the war. And I think particularly interesting in Syria is the fact that there have been some 400 local peace agreements. Now, some of these are just surrenders to government forces, but some of them are where the various urban leaders have come together to keep war out. I mean, Hama in Syria is, I think, a very good example where, you know, there was terrible bloodshed in the early 80s. And the leaders of the city really decided they wanted to keep both government and opposition out. So yes, there are huge differences in areas and huge tensions. And that's in a way the essence of what we're talking about, because what we're really interested in is how do you build on those areas that are relatively peaceful so they expand. Usually the focus is on the violent areas and how to stop it, but maybe this is another way of thinking about it. And that really answers the second questioner, who I think, I mean, I think everybody's a terrorist in contemporary wars in the sense that they use violence against civilians, whether they're government or opposition. And I think what happens is that these contemporary wars acquire a dynamic of their own in which violence is a goal for its own sake, either because it mobilizes people behind radical ideologies or because it's a source of income through loot, plunder, smuggling, checkpoints, kidnapping, and so on. So the question is there a way there can be institutional resistance? And that's, I think, everything that me and Saskia are interested in. How do we build institutionalized resistance? How does the external world assist those local yogurt runs to become generalized? And that, I think, is the key question. And that's why I think Saskia's work on global cities is so relevant, because it's, you know, can you develop, as you did in Bogota or Medellin in Colombia, can you develop civic strategies that help to reduce the level of violence? And then finally, the very interesting questions from our Polish representative. Yes, I agree that the war was very urban in the Second World War. And actually, when I talk about classic wars, I'm really thinking about the period from the mid-17th century to the mid-20th century, which I think was the birth of a very specific kind of interstate war. And in a way, it's almost a sort of heuristic device to say, these classic wars were in fields. They were battlefields, whereas contemporary wars are different. But of course, there were sieges, there were terrible things that happened to people, there was deliberate rape, there were all those things in pre-modern wars. And absolutely, these ethnic divisions are being played on at a national level, but they play out in terms of the inner dynamics of the city. And the idea that these different ethnic areas, I mean, it's also weirdly a kind of gerrymandering. You know, in many of the places where the international community has insisted on democracy, you need an ethnically pure area in order to win elections on an ethnic basis. That's actually the reason for ethnic cleansing in many places. So, and you find this being played out area by area. Baghdad is an extraordinary example where the civil war, 2007, 2008, really did divide the whole of Baghdad into Shia and Sunni, predominantly Shia, ethnic fiefdoms, whereas it had been before then a cosmopolitan city.
And one question, you know, Mary, that this suggests also is that something is happening that is a very significant transformation, which takes maybe different shapes, you know, in the West and in the East, sort of simply put. but that the kind of violence, I mean, I'm thinking of the violence of police forces in New York, in the US, right, which we all know that are often extraordinary brutality, absolutely often unjustified. Some policemen are okay, but I am sure that some of you have seen some of the things that, the conditions that people have filmed of abuse of police forces in the United States. And so that is a kind of urban violence, that I don't know where that takes us, but in the case of the United States, this is serious stuff. Britain, in comparison to the United States, is like angelical almost. You recognize the violence. Are you familiar? Well, you must have seen some of these images, you know, just extra, that police just sit on people and until they die of asphyxia, that kind of stuff. That has happened. Most recently, it happened to a woman, a Black woman, of course. I mean, the policeman just sat on her till she died because she couldn't breathe. And this whole notion of breathe, I can't breathe, you know, you've heard this, right? This is almost like a song now. I can't breathe, I can breathe. This is a line that recurs when police forces are involved in the United States in some of these situations. Now, in that sense, the police forces also add to a certain type of urban violence. And of course, we know that there is urban violence happening. It is of a different kind from wars, but still it can kill. I realize we shouldn't be talking too much if there are questions. I see that there are questions from the audience.
I just wanted to add to what you said, Saskia, that of course, what we are seeing is the drug wars in Mexico, Venezuela, that are not counted as war because they don't seem to be political, but they're actually very, very similar to the wars, that they have a similar sort of structure, which is why we need to think of these wars less as deep-seated political contests, but more as a kind of social system or social condition. Which are very similar. And actually the case study on the Mexican border is really about the combination of drugs and the war on terror in a very interesting way.
In fact, that reminds me, we should really mention that each of the chapters developed by a variety of people, none by us, are really extraordinary. It's really worth reading. What is good about the book are those texts, you know, and they really worked on that for long periods.
They really did.
Very often. They are quite extraordinary. But anyhow, let's go back to the questions.
Sure. Saskia and Mary, one of our participants asked, to what extent do international humanitarian laws continue to apply in urbanized conflicts? Is there a need to revise or indeed add to some of the principles in light of the changing theater of war? And to extend that, I would also mention the issue of protracted wars that end up are not always as intense as the ones in Syria or Yemen, but that protract themselves over many, many years, often in a low intensity form. And how do we think about these in humanitarian forms? And what are your thoughts on the challenge of humanitarian work and assistance in cities? Because obviously they have a different shape and different needs.
I have a huge amount to say about this because I did a book with my colleague Christine Chinkin on international law and new wars, but I'll try not to be too long. But I think the first thing to say is that contemporary wars, international humanitarian law was developed for classic wars. And the problem is they really don't apply any longer. And that's for a whole series of reasons. First of all, the nature of the conflict. International humanitarian law was supposed to apply to wars between state parties. Then you added this category of non-international war. But actually, the wars that we see just don't fit either of those categories. They're both international and not international. So that's a problem. There's a huge problem about the threshold argument for war. You know, somebody like Assad will argue that the protesters are enemies rather than citizens protesting, at what point does a protest become a rebellion and count as a war? Then there's the problem that you can't distinguish between civilians and combatants. It was very explicit in international humanitarian law that combatants should wear uniforms and be recognizable. Combatants sometimes dress up in funny clothes, women's clothing even, men in women's clothing, to be somebody else. They wear Ray-Ban sunglasses or Adidas shoes or all sorts of funny things, but they don't wear uniforms. And that has led to terrible attacks, all the attacks that happen on schools and hospitals, carried out by the Syrians, carried out by the Russians, carried out by the Americans, all on the argument that the civilians in those hospitals are actually combatants. But how do we know? So I could go on at great length, but the key point is that there isn't any longer humanitarian space. The idea that the humanitarian agencies can negotiate on the basis of humanitarian norms to create space to help people just no longer exists. And in fact, we get a huge amount of humanitarian assistance. A lot of it is subverted. The armed groups say we will allow you to deliver it, provided we can take 30 or 40%. And where civilians are being deliberately attacked, the idea of humanitarian space doesn't make sense. And this also relates to what you said about protracted wars. I mean, contemporary wars, whereas the classic wars, which were political contests, as Clausewitz reminded us, tended to the extreme. Contemporary wars do the opposite. They tend to be very inconclusive, to be very difficult to end. They tend to be a system in themselves. And because of that, humanitarian assistance has become a regular part of development aid. It's no longer emergency aid. It's a permanent feature of contemporary conflicts. And given that, we need to really rethink what humanitarian aid is doing and how we protect it and how we create humanitarian assistance. Does that mean we need a new system of laws? Well, alongside international humanitarian law in the post-war period has gone human rights law and international criminal law. And I think we just need much more emphasis, and disarmament law, chemical and biological weapons conventions. I think what we need to do is everybody has their own interpretation of the laws. We need to build an interpretation of law in which human rights law and international criminal law are the crucial elements of international law and guide the actions of the international actors.
Saskia, in addition to the issue of humanitarian assistance, I'd like to add another layer to this discussion, which is what sometimes is referred to as city diplomacy, or the ability of cities themselves to take on global issues of global relevance. We've seen that through climate change, the way that the C40 group of cities has had a global impact on the issue of climate change. Do you see agency to city governments and perhaps city civil societies to get together and maximize and display the sort of urban resources or urban resistance that you refer to in your talk?
Yeah, no, that's a very important point, because I think that city governance is a whole thing unto itself increasingly, because cities are very different, because there are many claims, you know. City government, number one, many of our cities were built a long time ago, so systems are falling apart. So what you are really seeing is that the city becomes a far more significant operational space. This is also linked to what are the bigger powers in terms of the economy. So a lot of not that the actual production is necessarily in cities, it isn't, but the firms that are the dominant firms, they are very much centered in cities. And they have altered. I would say that this period that we are living now, that really starts 20 years ago, it's the financializing also of urban space, because finance has become this ultimate flexible instrument that you can financialize just about anything. You know, a little pile of shit, we're getting there too, that we will be able to financialize, because it is some content. It is, I mean, it is very, in a city like New York, in a city like London, these things are very, very extreme. And that has meant that you have all kinds of actors that now need a space in the city, even as other sectors can leave the cities. And so what started as a nice story, a story of innovations, a story of, you know, young people developing nice whatevers, is now becoming far more problematic, because we have, for instance, we have major financial firms who are buying up big housing complexes for modest income residents. They're not interested in those modest households. For them, it's the buildings that count, because by algorithmic mathematics, those buildings become assets. You know, it could be the toilet, for God's sakes, but it's transformed in an asset. And what the high-level investors want right now is asset-backed securities. They want assets in there. They don't want just, you know, derivatives. Derivatives is for you and me, but the derivatives have had it. They're on the losing side. And so what they need is materialities. I mean, it's the ultimate irony. And so if you go to Goldman Sachs, you have 700 or something, or 70, I exaggerate, 70 physicists developing these instruments, you know, because this is algorithmic math. This has nothing to do with economics, the standard economics. So that is a whole other side that has meant that the city becomes a place where these types of novel it started really 20 years ago. Novel operations are very, very active. And that also means that you see big financial firms, as I said, buying up huge buildings. And you say, why are they interested in those buildings? Well, because the building is all kinds of other things as well. It's not just a building anymore. What we see as a building actually has other features in it. So that is another dimension, you know, and you see a lot of empty buildings. Milano, very fancy building, empty. New York City, some very fancy building, empty. You know what? An empty building is fine. Once you bring in algorithmic mathematics, who cares about people? It's about the materiality that can be transformed in an asset-backed security. Because derivatives are out, as I said, you know, that's for you and me, sort of. So the high level of investors, they can extract value now from certain conditions that maybe 20 years ago were not operational, but today they are. So that's a whole other set of issues.
Well, thank you very much. On that note, I think it illustrates perfectly the wide-ranging scope of this discussion, and very stimulating in nature as well. I think we've run out of time. Thank you very much, Mary and Saskia, and thank you also for putting together this very important book. I think it's a topic that has been getting gradually more attention, but still needs a lot of attention from good experts and more multidisciplinarity, which is something that your book and this discussion hopefully brings as well. So thank you also for our many participants. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time. Thanks a lot.
And thank you for organizing it.